Shabbat Shalom. This week's Parshat, we are introduced to the third patriarch, Yaakov. Parshat Toledot, Yitzchak, talks about the generations of Yitzchak. It introduces the birth of two dissimilar twins, Esav and Yaakov. And the Torah tells us that when Rivka finally was able to bear children, she conceived and fell pregnant. The children struggled in her womb. And she inquired of God and said, why is this the case? And God says, two nations, two separate peoples will issue from your womb. And the younger will rule over the older. And it's a common theme in the matriarchal stories of the younger ruling over the older, the smaller ruling over the larger. I see Brett's looking at his two sons. There's a midrash that teaches that whenever Rivka walked past a Beit Knesset, a synagogue, Yaakov would struggle to get out. And whenever she walked past a pagan temple, a pagan shrine, Esav would try to get out. So of course one would think, would argue with me and say, but surely in Yaakov's time there was no such thing as a synagogue because it came much later. And yes, you're correct, but the rabbis, in reading the text, superimposed the times of their current times onto the text. So for them, it was unthinkable that there wouldn't be synagogues. Another slightly different version of this midrash is that when Rivka walked past the yeshivot, the study houses of Shem and Ever, Yaakov would struggle to get out. Again, the rabbis couldn't contemplate a world where there was no Beit Midrash. And they, in the imagination, imagine Yaakov, the ancestor of us, the people of Israel, the Jewish people. In the imagination, he was studying Talmud. Of course, he must have been studying Talmud. So who was Shem and Ever? According to the Torah, Shem was the son of Noah, and he was the ancestor, Shem was the ancestor of the Semitic peoples. And Ever was his great-grandson. The word for Hebrew, the Hebrew people in the Hebrew language is Ivri, coming from Ever, his grandson. So Ever was the ancestor of Yisrael, of the Jewish people. And they established yeshivot according to the Midrash. And Yaakov was so keen to start studying Torah and Talmud that he struggled to get out of his mother's womb. That's the Midrash. Perhaps one can understand the struggle between the two siblings as a struggle of different worldviews, different cultures. Paganism is based on the fear of the unknown. And so you pray to the gods to protect you. Judaism is based on the belief of a loving but just God. God that is loving, that will take care of us, but imparts justice when we stray. Judaism is a religion of hope, not only for this world, but for the world to come. The pagan notion of gods is restricted and clearly defined what the deity is. Judaism believes in a God that is expansive and unrestrained. God is the God of the universe. God created the universe. God is transcendent. But at the same time, God is very much part of who we are. And as the Midrash puts it, while God is above everything, God is also behind the pillar in the synagogue. You can pray softly to God and God will hear. Paganism worship their gods through bringing sacrifices, usually animals, but sometimes even humans as sacrifices. Rabbinic Judaism teaches that we should worship God through acts of righteousness, acts of study of the sacred texts, the Torah and the Talmud, because God is a God of life. So Judaism is life-affirming, and paganism denies one's individuality and suppresses the divine spark within each of us. Judaism teaches positive energy, a positive outlook towards the future. Despite all the hardship that we've had as a people, despite the persecution that we suffered, despite the hatred that we suffer, unfortunately, now, Judaism is a religion of optimism for the future. We believe in the goodness of human beings, the goodness of the world that God created. Paganism sees the world through negative eyes. So the struggle between Yaakov and Esav is a struggle of different cultures and different worldviews. Yaakov was concerned with the spiritual. He was concerned with promoting the vision and the teachings and legacy of his grandfather Abraham. Esav was just worried about the physical needs and physical gratification here and now. And so I guess that's why Esav eschewed the birthright. He didn't see it as important. We have the story in the Torah, this week's Parshat, of Yaakov cooking a stew made of red lentils. And Esav, we are told, comes in, he's famished. He's been hunting all day in the fields. And he wants some nourishment, some physical nourishment. And he sees Yaakov cooking a stew, and he asks for some of the stuff, and he calls it some of the red stuff, Adom in Hebrew. So Esav is known as the red one, not only because he had ginger hair, but because he wanted the red stuff. And so he's considered to be the ancestor of the Edomites, Adomim, the Edomites. And when Yaakov says, I'll give you some stew if you give me the birthright, because you're the eldest born, he was born a few minutes before Yaakov. If you give me your birthright, I'll give you some stew. And Esav's response was, I'm about to die of starvation. What do I need a birthright for? Yeah, you can have it. I want some stew. He wasn't thinking of the future. The Midrash says that this stew that Yaakov was cooking was for the Toledot Havra'ah, the meal for mourners. Jewish custom dictates that friends and family of the mourners should provide them food when they come back from the cemetery. Abraham has died. Yaakov's parents, Yitzhak and Rivka, are mourning. And Yaakov decides to cook some stew for the Toledot Havra'ah. At this time of grief, of physical loss, he's looking to the future to continue Abraham's legacy. The human condition is a vulnerable one. It's easy for us to lapse into negativity, to see the bleakness of the world, especially now. We have a story in the Torah, of course, a well-known story of the 12 spies that Moshe sends to reconquer the land of Israel. And 10 of the spies say, while the land is glorious, as promised, the people settling there are too numerous and too large for us and too well armed for us to conquer. And 2 of the spies say, no, we can do this if we believe in God and in ourselves. The Israelites who had just come out of slavery not so long ago fear what lies ahead. And they protest and say, why did you bring us out of Egypt, O Moses, for us to perish when you enter the land. We're not going to go in. And so God dictates the Israelites spend another 39 years in the wilderness, a total of 40 years wandering. They couldn't see the brighter side of things except for Caleb and Joshua bin Nun, the two spies, who urged them to go into the land to follow God's command. We're living in a world which is often very dark. You need to take inspiration from Yaakov and desist from following Esav. Resist our impulse towards depression and towards pessimism. But follow the example of Yaakov, who did suffer in his life. He suffered from deceit from his father-in-law Lavan. He had to flee home because his brother Esav was angry when Yaakov finally got the blessing from Yitzchak, the blessing of the firstborn. He fled, not knowing what the future held, but having God with him. And the famous, we'll read it next week, the dream of the ladder, and God promises to look after him. So he flees, but he flees to a place where he finds his true love, Rachel. And the well-known story, which happens next week, of how Lavan tricks him into marrying Leah instead of Rachel. So he has to work another 7 years for his father-in-law to get Rachel. His father-in-law promises him wealth and says, any speckled and spotted sheep or goats that are born you can have, they're yours, knowing full well it's very rare for such animals to be born. But Yaakov uses ingenuity to make sure that he gets a lot of speckled and spotted sheep and goats, that he's wealthy. He's deceived by his sons, who tell him that Yosef has been torn apart by wild beasts, and he mourns for Yosef. But when he discovers that Yosef is alive and kicking in Egypt, and he joins Yosef, he reinvents himself. Yaakov takes a new lease of life. He dies a fulfilled man at the end of his life. You need to take inspiration from Yaakov, because Yaakov, of course, gets that other name, Yisrael, the epithet which we have adopted. We call ourselves Am Yisrael. The prophet Yeshayahu, Isaiah, tells us to be Or L'Goyim, a light to the nations, an example to the world. You can only do that if we suppress our impulses to the pessimism, suppress our Esavs that we all have, and follow the example of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Can you hear it, son? Amen. We continue with a prayer for peace on page 179.